So it feels amazing to be back filming in front of the camera once again, which might seem like a strange thing because if you have been watching my channel regularly, it looks like I've been keeping on schedule with those Tuesday and Thursday videos, but in fact, it's been several weeks since I filmed anything because of the fact that I pulled a muscle in my stomach and it was incredibly painful to sit up and film, let alone do anything. And so I have been reading a lot, but I haven't been filming. So here I am with probably part one of part two, catching up on the science fiction fantasy I've been reading over the last few weeks. I have so many books to talk about. Almost all of them are going to be new releases, if not all of them. And great books to talk about, great recommendations, some to skip over, some that weren't to my taste. You know the drill. If you're game for it, let's get started. First, let's talk about science fiction, starting with Jumpnauts, which again is a new release, a new science fiction title that's been translated into English that follows a future of our Earth where we have been divided into two factions that are very distinct. And so we follow the political divide between these two. However, a third component or entity comes into the mix when we make first contact with an alien race, a highly intelligent one that is there to work with us. And the story, of course, gets more complicated from there. So this is one I want to cautiously recommend if you're looking for something to read after the Three-Body Problem and its sequel. I did a whole video talking about where to go next with Cixin Liu as well as other authors. And in that video, I did recommend a book called Vagabonds. And I didn't realize till recently that this book is written by the same author as that one. So I can definitely see a connection there. This is again translated Chinese science fiction, so you get that cultural element brought into the story. So if that's something you loved about the Past Earth Remembrance trilogy, I think that you'll like that as well in this one because it definitely plays a part and you see things from a non-Western perspective. And once again, without giving away too much of the plot of Three-Body Problem, this one deals with entities on the outside and kind of that political maneuvering and trying to figure out the future of humanity. So it deals again with really big ideas. It plays around with characters, but once again, I'd say it's not horribly character focused. So if you're someone who really needs to know the characters, you need to fall in love with them, you need to want to be friends with them, they need to be well-rounded, dynamic individuals. I didn't have that experience here, but I didn't necessarily need it. I wasn't necessarily looking for it. And instead, this book was just playing around with some really interesting ideas. Some of the things I had heard about and some of the things were a little bit new or nuanced in ways that I found interesting. At times, I love this book more than others. I will be honest, there's some slower sections, especially the beginning. I wasn't immediately hooked in. I think especially with modern Western publishing, there's really a push to make chapter one this like hook of a chapter that's just going to draw you in and make you buy the book when you're sampling it at Barnes & Noble. And instead, this one, I kind of went along for the ride and said, okay, I'm going to at least read this far in and see how it goes. And I ended up liking it quite a bit. It's a book that is more cerebral, more intellectual. It's a kind of a book I appreciate because it left me thinking about it. I don't think it's perfect. I don't think it's the most enjoyable narrative. I think that something may always be lost in translation. It's hard to tell, but I know it's done by Ken Liu, who I do adore, so I don't want to say too much of the translation. But I think that this book, while not a perfect 5-star, I did end up giving it 4 stars. I liked it a lot. I see its imperfections. I see why other readers might like it less than me, depending on what they're looking for in their stories. And so if you're someone who is looking for that more traditional science fiction, more classic feel, more idea-based, and a lot of the modern science fiction that's more space opera and adventure-based and action-based is not scratching that itch, this is the one I'd recommend picking up instead. Highly recommend it to the right audience. I always say that. Next is The Knife and the Serpent by Tim Pratt, and this is a book that follows two individuals that find out that they have the ability to travel interdimensionally. This one individual has or had a grandmother who had this ability and worked for this kind of secret organization that did this, and so they got pulled into it. I am someone who in general tends to really like multiverse stories, whether it be in movies or books, so it tends to be a subgenre that always draws me in. I've read this author before. I've recommended their Axiom trilogy so many times in this channel, it's getting old. And so at this point, I will read anything else that they write. This one, I'll be honest, was a bit of a letdown. I think for a premise or setup that I am so easy to like, I found this one to be not that appealing. I found the characters to be very simple and perhaps kind of frustratingly immature, or just the book felt underdeveloped. I think that it had some good sprouts of ideas that never really saw fruition, and I think I just wanted a lot more from this book than I got. I found it to be fine. I found it to be not very memorable, and if you are going to pick up something by this author, I'd recommend something else. Even I didn't entirely love Doors Asleep, but I like that one a lot more than this one, and has a sequel. So personally, if you're looking for kind of multi-dimensional stories by this author, I would go with Doors Asleep before this one. This one kind of missed the mark, if you can't tell. Next up is The Unrelenting Earth, which is the second book in a series, or I believe trilogy, that started with The Surviving Sky that I read last year. This is a piece of science fiction mixed with fantasy. We follow this group that live in this sky city. You find out that the Earth has become very unstable. There is a lot of cataclysmic events that are going on, and they're trying to survive. Again, there's some more fantastical elements to the story, so the science doesn't feel as precise or hard as in some of the books I'm typically more drawn to. In the first book, it just felt a bit more like a debut. It felt a bit more underdeveloped, and a lot of my challenges or frustrations with the first book really worked themselves out. The characters felt more mature, the writing, the storyline, everything really came together a lot better in here. Given the general synopsis of this book, unsurprisingly, this series is always compared to the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, one of my all-time favorite books, and I do think it's a time where the comparison almost works against the book's favor, because while it deals with similar events, the complexity of the story, the characters, the narrative structure, everything is more simple, and so this one does feel like a junior novel compared to that. But again, it's a book that I like the first book enough to go on to the second, and I'm happy to say that the second is even better than the first. So if you're interested in series, you do want to go back to the beginning. I don't think it would make sense to jump in here, but it is a series that grows, and I will definitely be checking out more. Again, I think it's going to be aimed to be a trilogy, and I would love to see how it all works out. It definitely has a relationship focus to it, but there's enough other elements going on that you don't need to be a romance reader to enjoy this one. Just go in for kind of the ride, the immersion, and I thought it was overall a really good immersive read. I also read The Weightless World by Adam Soto, and this is a story that follows individuals working in development in Silicon Valley, and in this future, or this time period where the story takes place, there is alien contact, and so the story goes from there. It's one that is, first off, very underhyped, which is always something that appeals to me. I definitely enjoy bringing you all more lesser known titles, finding those hidden gems, so I'm always looking for something that I don't see talked about all over the internet. I've also had some pretty good luck in the past with reading books that are based around kind of techie culture and geekness and coding and all of that, so I'm always hoping that that will be another kind of hook into the story. And this one, in terms of premise, kind of reminded me of XX by Ryan Hughes, one of my favorite all-time weird, multifaceted science fiction novels. And this one had all the potential to be in that vein without the multimedia aspect to it. And there's a lot of build-up in this review to say that I really feel like this book missed the mark. I sometimes pride myself in being the reviewer that likes the unpopular things, so when a book has low reviews on Goodreads, sometimes that means I'm really gonna like it. Unfortunately, not the case here. This book has low reviews, and I get it. I added to it. I don't think that this book works. It just reads like a very dull contemporary story that happens to have some science fiction elements to it. The geeky parts aren't fun. The science fiction parts or the alien parts aren't that interesting. And it just feels like the author was trying to do too many things and didn't really commit to doing any of them very well. So I really did not like this book. Such a disappointment. I wanted to offer you this hidden gem. It is an underhyped book, but I can't say that it's a gem, unfortunately. I did not like this book very much and gave it a pretty poor rating on Goodreads. Next, let's switch over to some fantasy, starting with A Flame in the North by Lilith Saintcrow, and the new one that just came out, which is The Fall of Waterstone, also of course by the same author. And this is an epic fantasy series inspired by Norse mythology, probably my favorite kind of mythology to read and get an inspiration from. This story follows a young woman with some talents, and she ends up being pulled into captivity through circumstances and has to go into the woods. It's an adventure story, it's a coming of age story, it's very much someone coming into their own magical abilities, and there's a lot I liked about this one for sure, these two books. I think it's a strong start to a series with a good follow-up volume, and if you're like me, you might find this book a little bit, or the series rather, reminiscent of Horizon Zero Dawn, the video game, so kind of playing with, again, adventure themes and kind of going back to older mythologies and so forth, but doesn't have the science fiction or futuristic aspects here. So there's a lot I liked about it. It wasn't a story that wowed me. It didn't leave me thinking about it after I finished. It was kind of a good, enjoyable time, but not the kind of fantasy books that are going to crack into my personal all-time favorites. I would continue on and finish out what I believe is going to be a trilogy here, and I think that it has a good, strong female character at the center and kind of a good points. Like if you look at it objectively, I think the book is doing a lot of things right, but it didn't quite have that hook again, that feeling of, oh my gosh, this is a new favorite book. This is something I want to read over and over again, the same way that certain things do. But is it doing what it's attempting to do? Is it focusing and giving you this Norse-inspired fantasy story with exciting action and adventure and characters? It is doing all those things. It just somehow didn't quite hit that mark to really become something I'm going to completely love. Next we have The Darkness Before Them and The Fire Within, both by Matthew Ward. This is the first book, and then the second just came out this year, making a new release. And this is a piece of epic or grimdark fantasy, more so grimdark, that follows a young woman who is a talented thief. And within the story, it's framed that she's not meant to be the hero of the story. She's not meant to save the day, but instead she's someone who is trying to do kind of one last job to really get out of her situation, to escape, to move on, and is doing everything based off of really very selfish reasons, let's say. And so that's the setup to the story, which is actually one I really think is great. I love a character that isn't necessarily doing things to be the knight in shining armor. I think it's a bit refreshing. I do struggle with more traditional fantasy narratives that follow that more black and white, good and evil approach. So in terms of setup, I was interested in this one. I thought the writing was generally fine, but I really struggled, especially in this first book, to get interested in the story. I just found that it wasn't particularly grabbing me. The second book worked a touch better, but it's always the case when you're reading books in a series, if you're not already engaged to pick up the second book and, you know, wanting to know what happens next, it's hard to get into that mood. And so it's a series that I don't really understand the hype for. It's very traditional, despite the fact that it's trying to be atraditional and do something different. Really, it just feels very samey. Again, not very memorable, not different than something I haven't read before. If someone were going to be reading, say, 10 fantasy books a year, if they only read a couple fantasy books a year, is this one of the books I'd be recommending to them? Not necessarily. If you perhaps read hundreds of fantasy books a year, you've read all of the big buzzy ones, all the ones that ends up on the top 10 list, and you're looking for more and just simply want to spend more in fantastical worlds, maybe this one will scratch a better itch. For me, it really fell flat. I didn't care for the characters, which arguably, again, the main character is not meant to be likable in the traditional sense, but I actually tend to like untraditional narrators or protagonists, and instead I just found this character, the whole plot to be quite flat. It did kind of pick up towards the end with some interest, which made the second book here a little bit stronger, but I did struggle a lot with this series, I'll be honest. And I also read Mirrored Heaven by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is the third and final book in the trilogy that started with The Black Sun. I feel like I've talked about this series so many times, but it's epic fantasy inspired by a lot of different indigenous and South American cultures. You have a multi-POV story where you have different individuals that are coming from different backgrounds. There is an individual who is potentially the one or seen to be kind of the chosen one and going off to fulfill his destiny in the first book. You follow another character that is helping them to travel across the sea. There is various romance and interrelationships that inspire from there, which normally is not something I like, but I do admit that I kind of ship the couples within this universe, which is not something I normally say on camera, but sometimes a romance just hit that right spot for me when it's a little bit will they, won't they, and just I have fun with it. Anyway, so I enjoy this series for so many reasons. I think if you're already a fan of the series, you won't be disappointed with book 3. I thought that it had all the same elements I love, that rich world building, the multi-POV story. It's just a layered story that's very much about spending time with the characters, and so if you're looking to just spend more time with them, you won't be disappointed there. In terms of the ending, I'm not sure what I was looking for from the ending. It was a good ending. I don't think it missed the mark. I don't think it jumped the shark and did something crazy, but it also wasn't an ending that really left that final impact on me, if that makes sense. It just felt like the story had to end. The author had to wrap up the narrative. And while I liked it, I don't think that it's really the cherry on top of the sundae, if that makes sense. It's more a story that I enjoyed the journey versus having some incredible destination. It was just a place to end it, but still worth it. I've had a lot of series where the final book in the trilogy completely missed the mark and ruined everything the author was building before them, and that was not the case here, thankfully. Instead, it was just solidly consistent with the other two books, and so if you enjoyed those, I definitely recommend wrapping it up because this was a lot of fun. And last, I read House of Ulysses, as well as The Last Song of Penelope, the final book in the trilogy, both by Claire North, and this, of course, is the two concluding books in a series that started with Ithaca that I read a couple years back. I actually quite enjoyed that first one, even though Greek mythology is not always my favorite kind of retelling. This one is quite on the nose when it comes to the mythology, where again, we are following the characters of Penelope and, you know, we're on the island of Ithaca and so forth. It's very much playing with the characters of Greek mythology we already know, which again is not my favorite type of fantasy because it's a little bit too close to the source material for me to find it fresh and interesting. But the first book still really grabbed me. It was very feminine focused, very much focused on the women that were left behind when the men went out to war and to their adventures, and I thought it was just an appealing way of focusing on the part of the story that doesn't get focused on in the traditional myth. It's a very slow, character-driven story, which would be fine if I found the characters interesting. Unfortunately, I did not. I just found them to be pretty flat and one-dimensional in a lot of places. I liked the third book a little bit more, but neither of the books really lived up to my enjoyment of Ithaca, which in a way could be read as a standalone. So if you do just want to stop there, I think you can get away with that. If you love the first book more than I did, perhaps you'll want to continue on. And again, I think it really just depends on how much you love retellings of Greek mythology, because if you just can't get enough of them, you're going to have a very different reading experience than I did. I just found it okay, but that tends to be my experience with a lot of these type of books. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And if you are going to skip some, let me know that too. If you want to hear about more new release science fiction fantasy, remember to stick around and subscribe, because if it all goes right with editing, I will have another video part 2 coming probably the week after, because this is not all the books I read last week. I read so much when I was on bed rest, and I have a lot more to talk about that I didn't get to during this filming session. So if that sounds good, hopefully you stick around. If you want us to help me out with this video, I appreciate a thumbs up, dropping a comment, even if just an emoji. Try to find an emoji to represent like muscle pain or sickness or something, or bed rest, all those kind of things. I love when you get creative down below. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you won't miss a video from me, so you'll know when more videos are coming next week. Thanks so much. Talk to you then. Bye.